Well, in some ways, I think the Vatican looks at Archbishop Dolan as a sort of Mr. Fix-It. That is, whenever you've got a problem in the church, he is one of the guys you send in to troubleshoot. And I think that reputation began in some ways when he was first made a bishop, an auxiliary bishop in St. Louis in 2001. He became the focal point of that archdiocese's response to the sex abuse crisis. But it really hit the big time when he was named Archbishop of Milwaukee. Because there were two things about Milwaukee that made it a crisis situation. On the one hand, you had an enormous, raging sexual abuse crisis, because not merely did you have the broader national narrative, but you also had a longtime sitting archbishop, a very popular guy by the name of Archbishop Rembert Weekland, who was himself mired in a scandal. It turned out that he had paid almost $500,000 in archdiocesan funds, that is, the funds of the people of God in Milwaukee, to quietly settle a complaint lodged by someone that the Archbishop had acknowledged that he had had a relationship with, who also claimed there had been abuse. So you had a festering crisis on that score. In addition to which, Archbishop Weekland was a symbol of the kind of liberal instinct in American Catholicism, the kind of internal reform Vatican II vision of church. He had built up an infrastructure over 20 years that was passionately committed to that vision of things. People talked about Milwaukee under Weekland as the Milan of America, that is, the kind of centerpiece, showpiece diocese for reform of the church. And that is not the water from which Timothy Dolan drinks. I mean, Timothy Dolan is instead what I would call an evangelical Catholic, which means that his interest is not in reforming the church. His interest is in taking traditional Catholic identity for granted and then using that as a lever to change the world. So he represented a kind of 180-degree turn in vision, in kind of crude political terms, from left to right. So you had two different potential meltdowns that were waiting for Dolan when he stepped into the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And the magic of Timothy Dolan is that instead of exacerbating the crisis, in some ways he rescued that archdiocese from the crisis by restoring public confidence. He came in and first of all was enormously effective with the media, with the people in the pews, with the kind of the general public in projecting a warm, open, positive, affirmative vision of the church. Secondly, with that kind of liberal Catholic infrastructure, he came in positioning himself as a friend and a dialogue partner rather than somebody who was going to take a wrecking ball to what had previously been the case in Milwaukee. And although he probably did gradually nudge that church in a somewhat more evangelical direction, you know, there are also examples where he learned from what had gone on there and eventually was sort of converted to it himself. Dolan loves to tell the story of his first meeting with priests when he got to Milwaukee. He came in and gave this 45-minute lofty reflection about the theology of the priesthood and what it means to stand in the person of Christ and all of that. And at the end, he sort of closed his notebook feeling very good about the shot in the arm he had just delivered. And then he took questions. And the first three questions were things like, are we still going to have the highest priest salaries in the country? Are we still going to be able to live in our own apartments rather than moving into the rectories? You know, what's going to happen to our pensions? And Dolan says his first reaction was frustration. He thought to himself, good Lord, is this a Teamsters meeting or am I talking to priests? But secondly, as he began to work through some of those questions, he eventually became very close friends with most of the priests in that room. And eventually figured out a way that they could work together. And as a matter of fact, on the issue of living in the rectories versus living in apartments, he eventually came down on the side of letting those guys live in apartments because he saw the wisdom of doing so. And I think, you know, over time, what happened is that the people in Milwaukee, what they discovered in Tim Dolan was someone with whom they may not agree on all the issues, but someone who was genuinely listening to them and who genuinely wants them to be happy. And my experience of leadership in any arena, not just the Catholic Church, is that if people believe you were on their side, if they believe that you genuinely want what is good for them and you were going to genuinely listen to their opinions about what that good actually is, then you can manage virtually anything. And I think that was the Tim Dolan story in Milwaukee. It's been the Tim Dolan story in New York. And in many ways, it is now the Tim Dolan story on the national and international stage.